Well, thanks very much for having me here, folks. I walked in and Duke Johns walked up to me, and it's just like, wow, Duke, you're still alive. But yeah, I started out, my first faculty position was at Tulane, a shadow of its former self. And I can remember Duke coming to me and with all sorts of ideas on this and that and the other. I tried to convince him of a few ideas over the years. But
did I get you to come back to New Orleans?
you did. And I briefly lived just around the corner from here on St. Louis at Dauphine. And so I know kind of what it's like to spend a night in the French Quarter and waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, hearing people still reveling out on Bourbon Street. So, okay. So I want to move into explaining why transcutaneous CO2 is important to the anesthesia market, and I think it's a different market. I don't know whether you're used to selling in that market, but I'm going to explain a little bit about why it is that this is an important technology for anesthesiologists, and how it's going to fix some things that we've done for historical reasons, but we probably do wrong. So I want to explain why it is we measure CO2 as anesthesiologists, understand why end-tidal CO2 isn't really always the answer to what it is we want to know, and then discuss when transcutaneous is useful, and also a little bit about when it isn't useful, and try not to oversell the product for something that it's not the best monitor for. Okay, so why do we measure CO2? Well, there are really a couple of reasons that we're interested in it. One of it is that a lot of times we just intubate patients, we put them on ventilators of various designs, and we want to know how to regulate the ventilator. And we've sort of moved on a long time ago from doing, we're going to give 10 mils per kilogram of ventilation and hope that's going to be all right. We all now seem to target an end-tidal CO2 concentration, rightly or wrongly. Okay, so that's one big application of measuring CO2, and we got used to that. And it was important because CO2, the ability to detect CO2, was one of the things that took anesthesia from a mortality rate of about 1 in 10,000 down to where it is now, which is so low that it's hard to really accurately measure it. Okay, but the other thing is that we want to know CO2 because we'd like to properly adjust our sedation. We want to know where we're going to set a pump to give propofol, to give remifentanil, various agents like that. And CO2 is really an important way of looking into what the effects of these drugs are on the central nervous system. Okay, so what do we need to know about capnography? Okay, well, first of all, it can be mainstream, meaning we're capturing all of the exhaled gas going through a sensor, or it can be side stream. Most of you have probably seen mainstream a long time ago. It's probably going to make a comeback with volumetric capnography, but mostly you see side stream. Okay, and as I say, it can be time-based or it can be volumetric, and some of the most interesting developments now are in volumetric capnography, but it requires different means of measuring this. Okay, but really what it assumes is that the end-tidal sample is alveolar gas. Okay, and if it's not, and you're assuming that what you're getting, that somehow reflects what the arterial CO2 is, that's when you can make some really bad mistakes. Okay, so when is end-tidal CO2 wrong? And I'm talking now more in the setting of general anesthesia. So when the expiratory phase is relatively short, or when you have inhomogeneous lung, and you can see here, here's a capnograph tracing. I've got two problems here. Okay, one of them is that I've got inhomogeneous lung. So you can see that expiratory phase going up very slowly, and depending upon when I stop this, I'm going to get a higher number or a lower number, but that first breath there's no way you can convince me that the CO2, the arterial CO2 has changed that much from one breath to another, okay? And so when you have situations like this, all that the capnograph is telling you is what the respiratory rate is, okay? And I can kind of look at the machine and figure that out. Okay, so how does transcutaneous CO2 help in these settings, okay? And the first thing is that the accuracy isn't affected by changes in ventilatory modes. So I can switch somebody from pressure control to volume control, I can put them on APRV, I can do any sort of modes like that, and the transcutaneous doesn't really care because it's not really looking for that alveolar sample, okay? It's a continuous signal. Okay, and you know, as opposed to end tidal, which the number only exists whenever I get a breath, I have the transcutaneous signal all the time. And if you're a engineering control theory wonk like me, that's important. Okay, and I don't really, I do need to worry about changes in blood flow. Okay, so that's the one thing that can kind of mess me up a little bit with transcutaneous. And in the anesthesia market, that turns out to be a much bigger thing because we're doing things all the time that change blood flow. And here's an illustration of that. This is something, I didn't have a thumb drive with me. I just had my iPhone, so excuse the picture here. And you can see we're going along with the trend. Don't worry about what the units were. And you see, whoa, what happened here? And what happened here is that we're in the electrophysiology lab. Somebody gave, I think it was a dose of adenosine or something like that. And you can see, wow, look at that. And that's all changes in blood flow, okay? And if I tried to adjust the ventilator to try to fix that, it would have been the wrong thing, okay? And you don't usually see an example like this, but you'll see things like this happening. And you just have to, you know, explain to people, give them the concept so that they don't say, this monitor, it's worthless, okay? Because, you know, hey, that's something nice to know. It's just that it's not anything about ventilation. Okay, so what are some use cases for patients who are getting general anesthesia for using transcutaneous? Okay, so I spend a lot of time in the interventional pulmonary bronchoscopy suite. Okay, and it used to be people got bronch meads for staging of lung cancer. That doesn't happen anymore. Okay, I haven't seen a bronch mead at Penn in probably 8 years. Okay, everybody goes to the pulmonary lab, and we give them a general anesthetic with propofol and remifentanil. We stick in an LMA, and we do their biopsy that way. Okay, so why do we put in LMAs? Well, the reason we put in LMAs is that it's a big scope. And if you can't get a 9.0 tube in, it's pretty hard to ventilate somebody and have this in. You have an LMA, you've got a much bigger tube. Okay, so what happens, we put in the LMA, and most of the time it goes fine. We're ventilating just perfectly well. But every once in a while, we can't really ventilate somebody effectively with an LMA. Okay, and you know, so I come into the room and the resident says, oh, it's great, the end tidal CO2 is 22. And it's like, right, okay, no, it's the midstream end tidal, the midstream end tidal CO2 is 22, and you don't know what the arterial CO2 is, okay? So one good application, if you have a high volume endobronchial ultrasound service, is you put a transcutaneous electrode on somebody, you look at the end tidal, you look at the transcutaneous. If they're diverging, then you've got a problem, and you need to address that problem. Okay. Another area is one lung ventilation. Okay. You know, this is the archetype for inhomogeneous lung. Again, you're ventilating. You think you're really eliminating CO2, but you're not eliminating CO2 as well as you think you are. And you start seeing a divergence of these two measures, and you've got a problem. You need to address that problem. And then the other place I spend a lot of time is in the cardiac electrophysiology lab. and I'll come back, I'll spend a little bit of time on this. But about 10 years ago at Penn, we started doing AFib ablations with high-frequency jet ventilation. Okay, why do we do high-frequency jet ventilation? Because it improves outcomes. Less movement of the pulmonary veins, it speeds the procedure, increased precision of the lesions, better cure rates, less fluoro time, all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, trust me, it's a big thing that's sweeping electrophysiology labs now. Okay, so the ventilator that we use the most is the Accutronic Monsoon universal jet ventilator, which is made in Switzerland. I think not very far from where you are. And I understand that, I know Jim was telling me he's met Roland Hotz, who's the CEO of Accutronic, and so they have this very nice ventilator here, okay, and it can do a lot of really neat things. It was originally intended for things like tracheal procedures, some ENT, and that's where I got my initial experience with it. But now they tell me that more than half of their sales are in the electrophysiology market. Okay, so what are the problems with this thing? First of all, it's putting out a lot of gas. Okay, so you're typically putting out between 15 and 20 liters per minute of gas into the airway. Okay, so any CO2 that's there is getting diluted in that kind of flow. Okay, the second thing is you've got short expiratory times. We're running this thing at 120 breaths per minute, and so you really don't have a pause there to be able to see anything like an alveolar sample. Okay, and then you have a mixing of the inspiratory and the expiratory streams in the airway. Okay, and so the consequence of this is if you look at the CO2 tracing, it's just sort of oscillating a little bit around 5 millimeters of mercury. Okay, and you can't draw any conclusions from this. Okay, you can't really draw conclusions from the number on the screen that tells you how big of a tidal volume it thinks it's putting out, because the CO2 elimination can change quite a bit. Okay, so what are some approaches to knowing what we're doing? Well, one option is just stop the jet and give 3 big tidal breaths. And on the Monsoon 3, there's even a button that allows you to do this, okay? And if you're not in the EP suite, that's a reasonable option. Okay, if you're in the EP suite, unless you can talk to the electrophysiologist and say, hey, would you mind not burning right now because I want to get an end-tidal CO2, it's going to be fairly disruptive to what they're doing to do that. Okay. Second thing is you can just send in arterial blood gas. Okay, point of care, ABGs, relatively easy. You just say, hey, can you draw gas for me? They go out and they run it, and about 5 minutes later, you know what the CO2 is. Okay, but point of care ABG testing is not cheap. Okay, and the third thing you can do is transcutaneous CO2. Okay, which gets around all the problems of the other approaches to this. Okay, so some people I know up at Stony Brook published this in the open access Journal of Anesthesiology. It's hard to get stuff published in the regular anesthesia literature these days. Okay, and so what they did was they looked at the accuracy of transcutaneous PCO2 in the setting of high-frequency jet ventilation. So here's an example patient that you can see starting at time 0 baseline, conventional mechanical ventilation where they had end-tidals, and then periodic blood gases. And you can see there's a little bit of difference between the transcutaneous and the end-tidal. The end-tidal tends to be on the lower side. You can see when they drew blood gases, they tended to track the transcutaneous much better than they did the end-tidal, and of course there's no end-tidal during the entire time they're on jet. And something happened to my little indicator of where conventional and jet ventilation was. Okay, and then they did Bland-Altman analysis, and they saw a Bland-Altman plot before. And basically, these are all the times where they had our arterial CO2s to match up with the transcutaneous, and you can see here are the 95% confidence intervals, and there's the mean difference. And so the transcutaneous is going to run 3.5 millimeters of mercury below the arterial on average. Okay, not a problem. Okay, you just say, you know, whatever it is, because realistically, I don't care whether the CO2 is 36 or whether it's 39.5. I just want to make sure that it's not all climbing out of control. And so the correlation between the blood gas and the transcutaneous was pretty high, 0.843. Okay, bias, like I say, of 3.5 millimeters of mercury. And, you know, what I tell people is you have to wait about 5 minutes before you can really say what the full effect of a change in ventilation is going to be, but that's about on par with what it takes to turn around a blood gas. Okay, so it really, for us, has made a big difference. So to understand this, you have to understand something about how you go about tuning the jet, because I think a lot of people just think, well, if the CO2 isn't where you want it, just keep turning up the jet. But to understand why that's wrong, this is a compliance curve for the lung. So you can see if I've got a low driving pressure, I'm going to be down at the bottom of the compliance curve. So as I'm at low driving pressures, I'm going to get low excursions in pressure and very low excursions in volume because I've got relatively stiff lung. Okay, as I go to a high driving pressure, I'm going to get up and I'm going to again have fairly stiff lung, and even though I've got higher excursions in pressure, I'm still getting a relatively low change in tidal volume. There's going to be a sweet spot somewhere in the middle of the curve where the change in pressure that I get out of driving the jet is going to give me a fairly big change in volume, and that's sort of where I want to be operating it. Okay, and so understanding there's a sweet spot, and you don't know where it is in any given patient. What I tell people is that, number one, put the transcutaneous probe on early. Okay, I mean, and I'll have CRNAs. I'll walk in and they've got the monitor sitting there and the patient's ready to go to sleep, and I say, well, you know, put the monitor on, you know, and oh no, we won't need it until later. It's just like, I know we won't need it till later, but I want it working then. Okay, so put it on, you know, just put it on as part of the routine monitors. Let it stabilize, you know, and I tend to put it on the forehead, and the only reason is I'm in the EP lab, and so, you know, could I put it, you know, at the level of the clavicle? Yeah, sure, I probably could, but I know if I do that, every once in a while, somebody will trail a wire down across the chest, and I'll get called into the lab. Well, what's that line there? Oh, that's one of our cables. So you put it up on the forehead, it's okay. People, you know, we also have BIS monitors up there, and people will say, well, I can't put a transcutaneous and a BIS on the forehead at the same time, and it's just like, watch me. It's really not that hard. Okay. I haven't used SedLine in the EP lab. That would be, you know, because the electrode array is a little bit bigger, but still, there's room there. You know, you can get it on. You figure that out pretty quickly. Okay, so I put that on early. Okay, and I start the high frequency jet ventilation the earliest I possibly can. Okay, at a low driving pressure. Okay, now these numbers won't mean much to you because you've never played with a jet ventilator, but I'm going to turn it down fairly low, 10 to 12 pounds per square inch driving pressure. Okay, and so I know I've got a pretty good idea that's going to be down low enough that I'm going to have to turn the jet up, okay? And so I'm just going to sit there and watch. And if the transcutaneous trends up, I'm just going to increase the driving pressure until it stabilizes, okay? If it doesn't trend up, I'm going to say, okay, 10 or 11 or 12, that's just fine, okay? But the big thing is I don't want to adjust the jet ventilator once they've built the map. Okay, so they build this electroanatomic map, and if you start playing with the jet ventilator, after that point, you're going to shift their map, and then they're going to be saying, you know, hey, what happened to our map? So once you've tuned the jet ventilator, you can keep looking at the transcutaneous if you want, but don't respond to that. Just stick with what you have. You know, and people say, well, what if the CO2 goes up to 50? I said, well, the CO2 goes up to 50. I don't worry about that per se, because I'm an electrophysiology lab. I've got intracardiac echo. I've got every measure of electrophysiology known to man. I've got right-sided pressures. I've got left-sided pressures. Everything's going along fine, except for you don't like this one number. You know, I can't worry about that. Okay? Question.
So are you adjusting your jet ventilation to target a certain number, like 34, 35, 36? Once you get there,
kind of, but I mean, mainly I'm just adjusting it so that the transcutaneous isn't going up from wherever it was, you know, because I'll have ventilated the patient for a little bit before I turn the jet ventilator on. I might even have a baseline. Okay, so if I've got a COPD patient and they live at 50, there's no reason that I'm going to say, well, I have to have them at 40 because 40 is the magic number. So it's just a practical thing. And if you talk to anesthesiologists, they'll either get this or they won't. You know, but like I say, if you've got a baseline on them, just say, hey, that's my baseline. That's kind of where that's a reasonable target to have. And that's the nice thing about the transcutaneous is I can slap that on long before I have the availability of a blood gas, because I'm going to usually induce, intubate, run around, put in a radial line, send off a baseline blood gas. That baseline blood gas is only telling me about what my ventilator settings are. It doesn't tell me where the patient was living before they came into the room. Okay? So anyhow, so that's sort of a practical thing about how you function in the EP lab. And we can certainly talk about this more in the question session, but just so I have an idea, how many of you are aware of active electrophysiology practices in the hospitals that you cover? Okay, yeah, I mean, if you have people who have active electrophysiology units, then they're sort of a natural place to get interested in the Centec digital monitor, because it's really, it's changed things for us enormously.
I got another question. In our area, none of them are using vibrators.
Yeah, they will. You know, I mean,
but we're waiting for that shift to kind of happen.
Yes.
So how do we approach them if they're using conventional?
Yeah.
Do they not pause the ventilator when they're using conventional to do their related procedures?
No, you can't. You can't. Because I mean that's what they're doing. I mean they're spending 2 hours making these lesions. You can't. You can't just say, oh, we'd like you to hold ventilation for the next 2 hours. It's impractical, and so I mean there are other areas where motion suppression from ventilation are useful. They're not big areas yet, but in electrophysiology, the volume of it keeps going up. And and I don't. Do you want me to mention about, or have you had any conversations with the Susquehanna people yet, or that's premature?
Regarding
trying to help them out. No. It's next year's meeting. So okay. Question.
more so a comment, just, and you had a couple of slides earlier about end tidal and arterial. And a nice application, this would be more now, I round in a trauma intensive care
Yeah.
unit. We use a lot of end tidal because we have to follow dead space, although
Yeah.
it doesn't allow you to calculate it. A really nice application, if you've got end tidal on, put a transcutaneous, and the wider the gradient, the increase in dead space, and you're not having to draw blood gases, especially for hypotensive, if the therapist can't get a stick or the A line's out. It's a really nice application for transcutaneous in the critical care unit. The wider the gradient between the two, the more increase in dead space. We create a lot of dead space the way we ventilate patients, and our rule is hypoxia. Haldane's famous quote, hypoxia wrecks a machine. We don't care about the CO2 as long as the pH is above a certain level and you're hypotensive. But that's a really nice application for transcutaneous and end tidal together. So I wouldn't rule out end tidal.
Yes.
You just brought up a very complimentary use of CO2 when we've been back then. That's what you should do. Use it both.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They tell you a lot about what's going on with your patient.
Okay. All right, so now I'm going to move on to another area, which is monitoring sedation, okay? And the thing about sedation is that it's really now, if you look at the volume of procedural sedation, it actually exceeds the volume of OR anesthesia, okay? It's the biggest growth area for most anesthesia practices, okay? But closed claims analysis shows that liability exposure is higher for sedation than for general anesthesia, okay? And so, you know, when I, if I make it back tomorrow, I'll be in the outpatient endoscopy area where I might staff 35 colonoscopies and EGDs, and you know, my risk of seeing real hypoxia is a lot higher in an area like that than it is working in the operating room. Okay, and respiratory depression is the most common complication of sedation. Okay, and so now how do we process this in terms of you know, our approach to detecting changes in respiration? So we use.
I have a question. When you say the most common complication.
Yes.
Can you put that in numbers? Is that 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 10 or you know?
I'd probably go with, you know, I mean, and it depends upon how you want to define, you know, a complication. If you want, you know, I mean, if you want to say, whenever the saturation drops below 90%, we're going to label that a complication. That's pretty common. When you say, you know, like below a saturation of 80%, I'd say it's an unusual day in the endoscopy center where we don't see a saturation below 80%. Okay. Now that doesn't always result in bad things, other than you know, than people getting upset and boy, that was a near miss and stuff like that. I tell people I've only seen the pulse oximeter go below 2 on a couple of occasions. It went to 1 and then it went -, and I don't know, you know, for all I know, it might be capable of producing negative numbers. There's no reason not. I've just never seen them. I saw 1-0 on one of these non-beating heart organ donors, but I don't have long-term outcome data from that. So, okay, so anyhow, so back to capnography during sedation. Again, we're dealing with mid-expiratory samples, okay? And the inspired oxygen flow dilutes expired gas. We have lapses in data, poor identification of breaths, and inconsistent sensitivity of end tidal CO2 to changes in minute ventilation. I'm going to go through these real quickly, okay? So here again is some capnography, and you can see relatively fast respiratory rate. And again, you can't convince me that the arterial CO2 is changing breath to breath. These are just mid-expiratory samples. And so if the resident tells me, you know, boy, the CO2 was 30, and now all of a sudden it's 45, that's just a change in the monitor. It's not a change in the patient, okay? And so you have to get used to the fact that you don't always get the kind of data that you want out of this, okay? This is some stuff that was done by friends of mine at the University of Utah, Joe Orr and Laura Brewer. And so basically what they did was they came up with this system where they could interrupt the fresh gas flow to the nasal cannula during exhalation. So they could sample the CO2 with no auxiliary flow. Okay, and you see the blue circles up there. Oops, it's mislabeled. The blue circles are the intermittent flow. Okay, so you're really getting more of an end tidal sample, undiluted. The green samples are the constant flow. And so what you can see is that, if the patient is desaturating, you say, oh, I'm going to turn up the fresh gas flow from 2 to 4. Okay, now you're corrupting your data. Okay, so the people you most would want the accurate data on, you're least likely to get good data. Okay, if you want the best data, just turn the fresh gas flow off and see what the end tidal CO2 is, and say, well, gee, but now the saturation is 96%. It's just like, well, I don't worry about 96%. Okay, I know you can't bank oxygen. You use it up pretty quickly, but that's a hard sell for people. Okay, but the point is that supplemental flow is corrupting your data. Okay, now you get lapses in data. Okay, and when I look at this tracing here, I can kind of believe that something is going on starting at 30 seconds in terms of maybe the patient's breathing less or something like that. But I can't really say for sure what's going on. This just could be that the nasal cannula has gotten displaced and I'm no longer detecting CO2 there. So I don't really know what's going on, other than I know that somewhere about 45, 50 seconds, the alarm is going to start going off. Okay, and the alarm's going to start going off because there's this set threshold. Okay, and I don't really know what the data is from that point until I get those few big breaths. Okay, I don't know whether something bad has happened or whether it's just the displaced sensor. Okay, poor identification of breath. So again, this is some work that Laura Brewer and Joe Orr did at University of Utah. And so they recorded a lot of capnography tracings, and then they brought people in at various levels of skill and said, can you label the breaths here? Okay, where they had real flow measurements that they could say this is really when the breaths were. And so, how many breaths do you see on this tracing? Okay, and you could say, there are 3 breaths. You could say there are 10 breaths there, and these are when the actual breaths occurred by flow. And they found that even experienced people would be off considerably. I mean, they'd be off by more than 4 breaths in this 30-second strip. Okay, and so again, when you need this the most, it's when it's least likely to give you accurate information. Okay, and so the last thing is sensitivity of end tidal CO2 to changes in minute ventilation. This is a relatively complicated study to explain, but basically they took 3 groups: general anesthesia, awake volunteers, and procedural sedation, had simultaneous minute ventilation estimates and end tidal CO2, and they looked at the instrument sensitivity. I don't know whether anybody here knows what Deming regression is. W. Edwards Deming was the guy who taught the Japanese how to make cars. Grog was a big fan. Remember, he had everybody reading about the Deming method. But so he calculated what's called the instrument sensitivity, which is how much do you expect the CO2 to change as you change the minute ventilation. And so if you've got a theta of minus 90 degrees, that means you have a highly sensitive instrument. It can really detect what's going on. If you've got a theta around 0, it means it's got low sensitivity or no sensitivity. It's just a random number generator, okay? And so then these are 3 examples from sample patients just to illustrate this concept. So you've got all these paired minute ventilation and end-tidal CO2 observations, and now you're going to draw a regression line through them as best you can, and you're going to measure this theta here off of there. You've got general anesthesia in blue. You can see the numbers are fairly tight. Volunteers in green, a lot of spread, and procedural sedation in red. Okay, and so now you've got this data on the instrument sensitivity, and we're going to look at a histogram of the instrument sensitivity across a bunch of different patients. And so what you see is that during general anesthesia, end-tidal CO2 has a consistently high sensitivity, which is kind of what we expect. You've got an intubated patient, you can control the ventilation. It's a pretty good monitor most of the time, except for the cases that I discussed earlier, okay? If you've got procedural sedation, you've got this bimodal distribution of sensitivities during sedation, okay? You've got some patients where you've got high sensitivity, and you've got some patients where you've got very low sensitivity or no sensitivity, random number generator. And the last thing is if you try to ask an awake volunteer to deliberately hyperventilate, you don't really get reliable data, okay? Because you're just never, you can't just will yourself to change your CO2 set point. Big surprise there. Okay, so what's the takeaway message from this? End-tidal CO2 works well in general anesthesia most of the time. It works well in procedural sedation some of the time, and the times when it works poorly are the cases that cause the most problems. Okay, so if somebody, after hearing all this, say, I really like my end-tidal CO2 as a way of monitoring my sedated patients, I can tell you, all you have to say is, well, do you ever have a problem with it? Do you have false alarms? Do you have, false positives, false negatives? And then you start finding out that the people who are really there at the front lines doing this, they hate end-tidal CO2. They really do. It's just an annoyance.
Can you predict that?
Hmm?
Is it possible for the physicians to predict that?
You mean who's
When it's going to work well?
No, because when it's not working well, it's when you've kind of created the conditions that you want to create, which is moderate respiratory depression. Okay, yeah, Jim.
What would be a good response to a physician that tells you they don't care what the CO2 number is, they're more concerned about the waveform and the breath rate?
To which I say, yeah, that you're right, but you can't interpret that waveform that well. Okay, I mean, we can see people are going to look at that one graph and they're going to say, oh, there are 10 breaths there. The patient's in 30 seconds. The patient is breathing at a rate of 20. When in point of fact there were 3 breaths there, they're breathing at a rate of 6. It's the thing about it, I mean, without delving too much into politics, I mean, the ASA mandate for capnography, I think, was very unfortunate. I think that what they should have said is that you should use a reliable means of monitoring respiration, and understood that was going to evolve. I just finished up writing. I haven't gotten the revisions back from my editor. An article in Current Opinions in Anesthesiology on respiratory monitoring in out of OR situations. And you know, you're not the only company that's working on coming up with respiratory monitors, obviously. There are other approaches that, that people have taken. Massimo has their respiratory acoustic monitor. Respiratory Motion Incorporated has their Expiron. You know, there are ways of pulling respiratory rate off the photoplethysmograph, you know, different things like that. And so there are going to be good monitors for certain applications and bad monitors for other applications. But I think the point that I make in the article is that capnography is really a bad solution for the sedation market. You know, I tell people I don't worry, I plan, but you know, but yeah, I think, and what I can tell you is that if I've got a new grad CRNA in the endoscopy center, they're going to make a really big thing about getting the CO2 monitor on, and you know, they're going to be adjusting it, doing all sorts of things like that. The experienced ones, they put it on because, you know, the higher ups have said you have to have CO2 on every patient. I hook it up somewhere in the circuit, and I don't worry about whether it ever gives me CO2 or not, because I'm doing different stuff. Okay, I'm much more interested in, I put in Robert Hazy nasopharyngeal airways on upper endoscopies and hook it up to the anesthesia circuit and watch the phasic pressure change in the circuit, and you know, and the residents will like, we haven't seen a signal of breath on the capnograph. I said, yeah, you're right, but the saturation's 100%. You know, why would you care?
Yes. Do you find that during a MAC procedure you can actually finesse your propofol using the Centec? Have you ever had that experience?
I'll get to that in a little bit. Here's a plant here. So, okay. All right. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. All right. So what does transcutaneous add? Okay. So it's not affected by the factors that degrade capnography. So we've already talked about that. Okay. It identifies the patients in which the end-tidal CO2 is diverging from transcutaneous. So again, if you put both of them on, you're not wasting money necessarily. You're finding out, yeah, this is one of these patients where that I will have a poor correlation. So you learn something about how to when the end-tidal really isn't a useful monitor, but it's telling you this patient is not ventilating as much as I would have predicted. Okay, but most importantly, transcutaneous PCO2 correlates with drug effect. Okay, respiratory rate doesn't. Okay, if I have somebody breathing at 20 or 30 breaths per minute, I can't make any conclusion about whether they need more propofol or less propofol. I might be able to make a conclusion about like whether they need more remifentanil or not, but propofol, no. Okay, there are all sorts of different things. If I've got somebody who's sitting at their baseline CO2, then I know I haven't given them very much propofol. I can probably give them more. Okay, and we'll get to this in just a little bit. So it may be useful in closing the loop. Okay, so if I want to build some sort of feedback system for this, either using a computer or just using my head, I can close the loop with transcutaneous. So I'm going to get into this in just a second here. Okay, so this is some work that was done at ETH Zurich. Do you know Antonella Caruso? No? Okay. But so anyhow, so basically what they did, and this was all done in simulation, but they've done a lot of work on coming up with mathematical models of CO2 response to propofol. And so then they said, okay, can we build a control system that can just target a transcutaneous CO2 and I'll adjust the propofol for this. So you can see here that what they've done is you've just given a command, take the CO2 to 50, and it turns the propofol up for a little bit, turns it down, and just adjusts it. And at least in concept, they can hold the CO2 where they want to hold it. This is all done in Zurich. And the guy who did, the guy who's the driving force behind this, this is his PhD dissertation at ETH, Antonello Caruso, and he since went off and is working for, I forget which drug company in Switzerland. And so, like many great PhD dissertations, he finished it, he got his PhD. Nobody has tried to take this into the clinical arena for a lot of reasons. There are reasons to believe I was part of an FDA panel a couple of years ago on what the FDA is going to do about regulating closed-loop physiologic control, and they're starting to come up with a roadmap that might mean that you could try to bring something like this to market, but it's a much harder problem than you would think from a regulatory standpoint. Okay, so. All right. So can we do this? Okay. Can I give you a cookbook for how you can use the transcutaneous CO2 to control propofol? Okay. So we're going to do that right now, just because you asked. I added the slide. Okay. Yeah. So okay. So I'm going to pick two infusion rates. Okay. I've got a high rate, and let's just say that high rate is 100 mics per kilo per minute of propofol, okay? And then I'm going to pick a low rate, and let's just say that's 20 mics per kilo per minute, okay? And I'm going to set the pump to one of these two rates, and then I'm just going to pick a target transcutaneous PCO2, okay? And I'd recommend just saying, whatever your baseline is, you got a stable baseline, I'm going to say I want to bump that by 10 torr. Now I'm just going to say when I'm below the target, I'm going to use the high rate. When I'm above the target, I'm going to use the low rate. Okay, and for complicated reasons, I can tell you the closer the high rate and the low rate are to each other, the smaller the oscillation is and the longer the oscillation period is going to be. And so you're just going to oscillate between, let's just say 12 and 8 above baseline. Okay, never being at exactly 10, but there's a limit to the downside. Okay, if you're willing to give somebody 100 mics per kilo per minute of propofol as an infusion for sedation, then that's the worst you're going to see. Okay, you could have the low rate 0 if you wanted, but I would probably pick some number that you'd be willing to set at. And you can do this, and you can just sort of run somebody along, and you can achieve whatever level of respiratory depression you're willing to tolerate. And like I say, a 10 torr increase in transcutaneous CO2 is probably something that once people get a little bit of familiarity with using this, with whatever sedation they use right now, they'll say, okay, yeah, that's reasonable. That's about what we're used to seeing. Okay, and so now not everybody is going to go for this, but the people who like this, their eyes just light up, like, wow. That is so cool, okay? And because it's something you can write down on one little note card and say, here, this is how you do the anesthetic. And as long as you just keep watching the transcutaneous, or heck, just set an alarm for your set point. And when the alarm is on, I'll go to the low rate. When the alarm is off, go to the high rate. You don't really have to think about it that much. Okay, and this is sort of the level, what transcutaneous offers us, okay, as a method. Okay, so let's just give a little bit of summary, and I'll move into some practical points. Okay, so anesthesiologists are used to end-tidal CO2. Okay, it's hard to get end-tidal CO2 away from an anesthesiologist just because, you know, if you're like me, I trained just before end-tidal CO2 became something that you found in every operating room. And people know, you know, we used to stick tubes in the esophagus and find out about it 8 minutes later when the surgeon would say, you know, the blood looks awfully dark. Okay, end-tidal CO2 was one of the things that changed that, along with pulse oximetry. Okay, but end-tidal CO2 can be wrong, and it can particularly be wrong in the setting of procedural sedation. Okay, and transcutaneous adds new information that guides us when end-tidal CO2 leads us astray. Okay, and so those are the things to bear in mind when you're talking to an anesthesiologist. Okay, and I'm going to I jotted down a few practical points. Certainly, it's not a limit to what we can discuss. But these are just some things. If you go into an anesthesia market, okay, I will tell you all those little gel bottles, and I know you're going to these single-use things. It is the single biggest reason that I see somebody doesn't put the transcutaneous on. It's just like, oh, I've got the machine, I've got the ring, you know, it's been calibrated and all that, but I can't find the gel bottle, okay? And, I don't know, somebody, you know, like probably you could go to the dollar store and you could find some like little thing that you would put Purell in or something like that. But just get something like that and tape it to the machine or something like that so that they can't lose the freaking gel bottle, okay? Because it's, like I say, it's all the time I'll have, you know, like, where, you know, why isn't the transcutaneous hooked up? Oh, no gel bottle, okay? As I alluded to earlier, replace the monitor early, okay? You know, it's, and again, you'd be just amazed at people, you know, it's just like, oh, no, I'll get it in later and hook it all up. And it's like, no, just put it on now, okay? And then the other thing is, for anesthesiologists, we all have pulse oximeters, okay? So just switch it into the transcutaneous only mode so that, and put up the 30-minute trend so you can watch the trend. Okay, and that's the thing that you know, when I'm teaching people how to use the monitor, is just like, don't look at the number, just look at the trend. I'll put that trend up. If you see it going like this, or you see it going like that, or you see it going like that, that's what you want to know. You know, look at it every few minutes. Don't stare at the monitor continuously, because it's just not that, it just doesn't change that fast. Okay. And if you, little things like that get people much more comfortable with the monitor, okay? And so with that, and any questions that haven't been asked already?
I'll go to your gel issue. Do you ever use either normal saline or water when you can't find your gel?
I haven't tried.
Could you repeat the question back?
If I don't get the gel, have I tried normal saline or water? I don't know, would that work?
Yes.
It does? Oh, okay, well.
Short term.
Sure.
Short term.
How long?
A couple hours.
Yeah.
Maybe, just side time.
Okay, yeah. So drop some water in there and then go find the
drop.
gel? One drop?
One drop. How many? One drop, sir.
One drop? Okay, I've learned something here. Okay,
One drop.
all right.
Is your paper covering a lot of this, and has Centec asked you to give a webinar on this topic?
So the current opinions in anesthesiology article, my editor, who happens to be my colleague, walked past me Thursday, and he says, I've got some trash to read. And so, you know, how many of my editorial comments he'll leave in, I don't know, but the facts will be there. Like I say, I cover a number of different monitors, you know, and I think that different monitors are useful for different things. I mean, I think that the Expiron is probably a much better monitor for rapidly detecting the onset of apnea. Okay, I think that trying to detect sudden onset of apnea with transcutaneous, will it change? Yes, but not as fast as an anesthesiologist would want. Okay, the Massimo acoustic respiratory monitor. If you've got Massimo Rad-7s sitting around, it's a pretty easy system to start using. Okay, those aren't the competitors that you want to look for. I mean, the Rad-7 isn't going to tell you what the jet ventilator is going to do. I've got an Expiron in my lab that we're planning on looking at with the jet ventilator. They tell me absolutely there's no way that thing is going to detect jet ventilation unless they go into the raw signal, because they filter those frequencies out. On the other hand, the transcutaneous was just an instant hit. I mean, it's completely changed practice in the EP lab in terms of tuning the jet ventilator. So, so yes, the current opinions article will be out at some point. Doing a webinar, you'll notice that in this entire talk, not once was your company name put there. That was deliberate because I could now use this in a CME. It's not it's not marketing material, and so as you know, the whole CME thing, it's not as much fun as it was when I, 20 years ago when I was flying around the country giving talks on sevoflurane for difficult airway management. Nobody really cared about what you did. I'm here. I mean, other than Jim paid for my trip down here and the hotel. I'm not taking an honorarium for this talk, just simply because I'd like to do some original research with the monitor. And the moment I put a dime in my pocket, then it's just like, oh, you've got a conflict of interest. So as long as we can do things in a way that it's clear that I'm talking on my own, on my own experience, my own reading of the literature, my own research. I'm more than happy to help people with this because I think you've got a good product. Okay, and if you're, I've got an engineering degree. If you work in engineering applications in monitoring and anesthesia, as my friend Jim Phillip likes to say, if you don't have a conflict of interest, you're probably not doing good stuff. But but having said that, I don't think I'm not out there to make the winners and losers. But if somebody has good technology, or I can do something to improve the technology, I think that's how you make things better in anesthesia. So
thank you.
Okay. Other questions?
I would like to add something up here. Who knows?
Yeah.
I would like to add something up here regarding the closed loop control, what you showed before.
Yeah.
Antonello Caruso. I have to admit, I've been working on that research group. Uh-huh. Someone else you all know here is Peter Schumacher. He's the head of R&D at Centec these days. Mm-hmm. And it's not as easy as what you've seen here. This was kind of the best example. That's probably from the publication with Professor Manfred Morari from the ETH. So the sedation control with the transcutaneous is a little bit more tricky. I'll be a little bit cautious in just saying everybody you can control it easily and you can adjust your sedation. That's what I would like to point out.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate. I mean, I have a master's degree in control theory, and I can tell you closing the loop in a physiologic system is always a problem. But having said that, I mean, I know a bunch of people who are trying to close the loop with BIS, and if you're targeting a BIS of 50, that may be possible if you're trying to target a BIS of like 70 or 80, as you would typically see in sedation. Almost impossible. So I'm, you know, if you want to put me in touch with, is Antonellis still there, or he moved on?
No, he's working with Roche, to my best knowledge. That's a pharmaceutical company, Roche in Basel.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. But you know, I think it's exciting stuff, and I think that the future, you know, people ask me, you know, like, what's the future of anesthesiologists, and like they look at it as this big battle between CRNAs and anesthesiologists, and it's like, no, it's the artificial intelligence that's going to change anesthesia. It's going to be all these intelligent systems that are going to do things that people assume that you have to have an experienced person sitting there staring at the monitor. And, you know, and going back to the question of what do you say to someone who thinks that you can stare at a monitor, try to extract data out of a capnograph while you're trying to deal with giving propofol and holding the patient down when they're light and doing jaw thrusts and all that. It's just like, no, you get little glances at it. It's hard to really extract features. So, okay.
I have another question.
Duke.
I'm assuming the Monsoon is a very expensive piece of equipment.
It's anesthesia expensive. So you know what I mean by anesthesia expensive.
I just saw quoted it's $45,000 for the unit.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
So a lot of us have IPV, cushion air.
Yeah.
They make a little bitty transport vent, which is high frequency. Could that not be used for high frequency ventilation?
No, it does different stuff, and I could explain it to you, but you know, I mean, people, you know, like, why can't I just turn up the rate on my Fabius? And the answer is the compressible volume in the circuit eventually kills you on that.
There is no compressible volume of the circuit on an IPV device. Have you worked with that device?
Haven't done with. I wrote an article on this. You know, I mean, I'd be willing to try it, but I can tell you it's not going to do as well as the Monsoon. And remember, when I say it's anesthesia expensive, you know, the most expensive thing that an anesthesiologist has to buy is a modern anesthesia machine. Maybe a TEE machine, but we don't usually buy them. Okay, if you go into in an EP lab, and how many people here have been in EP labs? Okay, if you look around in an EP lab and you look for a box that big that only costs $45,000, you're going to have a hard time. You know, I mean, these people, you know, it costs like about $2 million to kit out a modern EP lab. Okay, so so if you say, well, how much does it cost to kit out an EP lab with a jet ventilator? Well, the rounding error on that $2 million purchase. You know, I mean, it's as long as you get the electrophysiologist to buy it, they're not going to care. I mean, I mean, I convinced them at Penn we needed to get an extra one just in case one of them needed to be out for service, because you know it's just not expensive for them. I mean, they open up catheters that cost $2,000 a pop, and they say, oh no, not this one. Yeah.
It's kind of like the gel. It's kind of like the gel.
Well, oh no, the gel. That's, you know. that comes out of the anesthesia cost center. So, okay.
Dr. Mandel.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So first, I would like to thank you very much for this great talk. But I think education is key, and getting the word out. I mean, your presentation, getting to the next generation of anesthesiologists. What would you recommend us? Where should we start? To support, this continuing medical education. But what could you maybe suggest?
I'm really excited about the transcutaneous oxygen product. I think that that's going to teach us about a lot of things that that we just don't know about. That what happens above a saturation of 100%. And so I think there are going to be some interesting applications to come out of that. Like I say, right now, what I think is the interesting work that needs to be done is more of this work on looking at transcutaneous as a way of closing the loop on anesthesia control, because I think maybe 10 years from now, certainly 20 years from now, that's going to be the standard of care.
Are you familiar with Dr. Laban Lester from Hopkins? He's a young professor of anesthesia. That's exactly what Jim and I tried to help him with the Oximeter, where he was very interested in looking at the projections and the possibilities of measuring the real-time PO2. But we just didn't have the product mature enough to.
Yeah, I don't know him. I've been down to Hopkins to teach them about jet ventilation, but
Well, he uses a monsoon as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Syntax for that.
Yeah, and like I say, it's there's a pretty good chance if you walk into an electrophysiology lab and they've got a monsoon and you mention my name, they're going to say, oh yeah, that he's the one who explained how to use it. I didn't invent jet ventilation, but somebody explained to me the difference between and you'll forgive me for not knowing my Catholic liturgy here, but which were the original disciples, compared to Jesus, that they were the ones who went out and publicized, and got things out to the world. And I'm one of the disciples of jet ventilation, and so have really, as a result of that, gotten to talk to a lot of people about it. And like I say, when people want to know how do we regulate CO2, then I put them in touch with Jim.
Do you know any jet users in California?
Any jet users in
California? I'm trying to think of who's called me from California. UCSF. I know they do some. Trying to think about. I know UCLA. I've got friends there, and they gave me a blank stare when I talked about it. So not there, but. In the Northeast, it's very popular, and the EP world. It's like, remember the scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where they're all sitting around the table, all the pirate kings, and they've got to take a vote for who's going to be the leader. Well, that's how the EP world is. There are about 7 really big pirate kings in the world of EP. And the guy I work with, Frank Marshlinsky, is one of the pirates at the table. And Frank goes around the world talking about how much better jet ventilation is for him. And it's basically like you can imagine the difference between standing on solid ground and standing on a pitching deck trying to do anything. There's just no learning curve for it. It's just like all of a sudden stuff is motionless, and and they just love it. So, they love it, or they'll, in some way, it sort of cheapens their profession. Like, I don't need this. I'm good enough that I can work on the pitching deck. So, go figure. Okay. All right. More questions.
I have a hospital that is in the process of getting in the monsoons. I have a hospital that's in the process of buying the monsoons, and what they're interested in Centec for is primarily one lung ventilation, but then also during a cabbage. During a cabbage, from what I understand.
So which hospital is this?
Greenville Hospital Systems down in Greenville, South Carolina.
Huh. Okay. trying to think if I've heard from them, but I mean, it is an application. The people in Freiburg have done a lot of work with that, and I think there's another group in Berlin that have done work with that. And you can kind of keep the lung out of the way, jetting the down lung. So.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much.